Ask almost anyone what caused the Civil War, and you'll get the same confident one-word reply: slavery. The North opposed it, the South was built on it, the two sides fought it out, and the right side prevailed. It's a clean, satisfying account, tidy enough for a bumper sticker, and it leaves out nearly everything that explains how 620,000 Americans ended up dead. That answer isn't wrong exactly, but it's a truth that conceals more than it discloses. Pull back the curtain on the tariff battles, the bank ledgers, the deals struck behind closed doors, and 4 decades of mounting brinkmanship, and the picture looks very different. This was never a simple morality tale with a clean resolution. It was the violent culmination of an economic standoff that had been building since before most of the men who eventually fought it were even born, a head-on collision between 2 incompatible engines of wealth, 2 rival visions of what America should become, and 2 ruling classes who each understood precisely what hung on control of the land stretching west. Whoever held that territory would hold the country. Before going any further, I want to be direct about something. This conflict had slavery at its very core. It was the foundation the Southern economy rested on, and it was the era's defining moral crime. The nearly 4 million human beings enslaved as of 1860 were not line items or economic inputs. They were people, and the story of their suffering, their endurance, and their resistance ranks among the most important chapters in the American story. Nothing in what follows is meant to soften that truth. Here's what most people never learned, though, and what a growing body of historians has spent years insisting on. Slavery didn't function only as a system of forced labor. It operated as a financial instrument in its own right. In a very real sense, it was a form of currency, used as collateral, extended as credit, and wielded as raw political and international leverage. To understand why the nation tore itself apart between 1861 and 1865, you have to follow how deeply slavery was threaded through the country's entire financial architecture, and not only in the plantation South. Wall Street, the banking houses of London, the cotton mills of Manchester, and the railroad offices of Chicago were all part of it. So, rather than starting at Fort Sumter, let's go back several decades earlier to where this story genuinely begins. Not on a battlefield, but inside the halls of Congress, in trade negotiations, and in the ledger books of the world's most powerful banks. Begin with something almost nobody covers in a history class: the Tariff of Abominations. In 1828, Congress enacted a law that would turn out to be one of the most explosive of the young republic's history. Its formal name was the Tariff of 1828. Southerners had another name for it almost immediately. On paper, this looked like ordinary trade policy. It imposed steep duties on imported manufactured goods, in some instances pushing rates close to 50%. The stated rationale was shielding the fledgling factories of New England and the Mid-Atlantic from being undercut by cheaper British goods. What most textbooks fail to mention is that this wasn't simply protection for northern manufacturers. It functioned as an economic weapon, and the target was the South. The southern states of this era were overwhelmingly agricultural. Cotton, tobacco, rice, and sugar formed the backbone of the region's economy, and virtually all of it depended on trade with Europe, Britain above all. Southern planters exported their raw materials to British mills, and in return, imported British manufactured goods, clothing, tools, machinery, nearly everything they lacked the capacity to make themselves. It was a tightly interlocking relationship. Britain's Industrial Revolution ran on Southern cotton, while the South, having built almost no manufacturing base of its own, depended on British imports to function. So when Northern legislators pushed through a tariff that made those imports substantially costlier, Southerners understood exactly what it meant: a transfer of wealth. Northern factories were shielded from foreign competition, while Southern planters absorbed the cost through inflated prices on nearly everything they had to buy from overseas. There was also a genuine fear that Britain might retaliate with tariffs of its own, a move that could cripple the cotton trade outright. The reaction across the South was swift and furious. South Carolina, led by its own sitting Vice President John C. Calhoun, refused to settle for mere protest. Instead, Calhoun and his allies constructed an entirely new constitutional theory to fight back with. Writing under cover of anonymity, Calhoun authored a document that became known as the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. It laid out the doctrine of nullification, the argument that any state could, on its own authority, declare a federal law void within its borders if that state judged the law unconstitutional. Take a moment to consider what that actually means. 3 full decades before the first shot was ever fired at Fort Sumter, a sitting vice president of the United States was quietly drafting the legal and philosophical foundation for secession itself. And tellingly, slavery wasn't the direct trigger. A fight over taxes was. In truth, the tariff dispute and slavery were never really separate issues. The South lacked manufacturing for a specific reason. Its whole economic model depended on enslaved labor working plantation land. Its reliance on British trade existed for the same reason. That model produced raw commodities, never finished goods. Trace the tariff issue far enough back, and it always leads to slavery. Yet the actual mechanism, the constitutional showdown that nearly tore the country apart 3 decades ahead of schedule, was never publicly framed as a debate over the morality of human bondage. It was presented instead as a struggle over economic sovereignty, over states' rights, over whether the federal government had any business enacting policy that benefited one region at the direct expense of another. By 1832, matters had escalated into a genuine crisis. South Carolina formally adopted an ordinance of nullification, declaring both the 1828 and 1832 tariffs void within its borders and openly threatening to leave the Union if Washington tried to collect them regardless. President Andrew Jackson responded with the Force Bill, which authorized the use of military force to enforce federal tariff law. For one genuinely alarming stretch, the nation teetered on the edge of civil war. Henry Clay negotiated a compromise tariff in 1833 that pulled the country back from that brink. But something fundamental had already shifted for good. A precedent had been set. A southern state had openly threatened to abandon the Union, and the federal government had opted to negotiate rather than simply enforce its own laws. Secession had stopped being a theoretical possibility. It had become a loaded weapon left sitting on the table, waiting for someone to pick it back up later. This is the first major point that popular retellings of the war routinely get wrong or badly understate. They tend to treat secession as though it sprang up out of nowhere the instant Lincoln won in 1860. In reality, secession had already been rehearsed, debated, and nearly carried out 3 decades earlier. The Nullification Crisis served, in every meaningful sense, as a dress rehearsal for 1861. The script was already written, the arguments were already sharpened, the constitutional theory already stood complete. All that remained was waiting to see which spark would finally ignite it. Now, to understand why the stakes were so enormous, there's something about slavery that most people never fully grasp. By 1860, enslaved human beings made up the single most valuable financial asset class anywhere in the United States. Not cotton, not land, not railroads, not factories, not banking houses, people. The nearly 4 million men, women, and children held in bondage were collectively valued at somewhere close to $3.5 billion in 1860 dollars, a sum greater than the combined worth of every railroad, every factory, and every bank operating in the country at that time. That figure came out to roughly 1/5 of the entire country's wealth. In today's dollars, you're looking at something in the neighborhood of $13 trillion. Sit with that number for a moment before moving on. Most of us are taught to view slavery strictly through a moral lens, and that framing is correct as far as it goes. But the slaveholding class of the American South wasn't only defending a way of life, it was defending the largest single concentration of capital found anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. At bottom, these men were guarding their own balance sheets, and this is where the story becomes genuinely uncomfortable, because the money involved didn't belong exclusively to Southern planters. Banks, insurance firms, shipping companies, and textile mills across the North were all entangled, deeply and inseparably, in the business of human bondage. Consider what was unfolding on Wall Street in the years before the war broke out. Cotton was the engine of the American economy. By 1860, it accounted for something like 60% of the nation's total exports. Enslaved workers grew it across the South, but it was Northern merchants who shipped it, Northern banks that financed it, Northern underwriters who insured it, and Northern commodity exchanges that sold it, all before a single bale ever reached the docks of Liverpool or Manchester. From the plantation all the way to the textile mill, this formed a single unbroken transatlantic financial network, and enslaved labor greased every link in that chain. A number of America's most well-known banking institutions trace their roots directly to this foundation, including the predecessor of a bank still operating today, the firm that would eventually become Citibank. Financiers based in the North moved the cotton, converted raw agricultural output into liquid cash, and funneled that money directly into Northern industry, into railroad expansion, into real estate, into the stock market. Little of the wealth generated by enslaved labor in the cotton fields of Mississippi and Alabama actually stayed in the South. It moved north and outward instead, landing directly in Wall Street vaults and Northern industrial treasuries. Nor did the money trail end at the Atlantic. British merchant banks extended lines of credit straight to Southern planters, effectively bankrolling slavery's expansion westward into the Deep South. Banking houses headquartered in London and Liverpool financed the purchase of both land and enslaved people throughout Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. Southern banks, for their part, developed entirely new financial instruments to serve this economy, accepting enslaved human beings as collateral against loans. They designed mortgage-backed instruments in which the underlying asset was a human being. In Louisiana alone, one institution, the Citizens Bank, held mortgages on nearly 9% of every enslaved worker in the state's wealthiest sugar-producing parishes. This was not some isolated regional peculiarity. It was a national system, and in the fullest sense, an international one. So, as abolitionist politics began building real momentum through the 1840s and into the 1850s, what alarmed the Southern elite wasn't simply the moral argument against slavery. It was the genuine possibility of $3.5 billion in wealth disappearing overnight. Imagine a single piece of legislation wiping out a fifth of the entire country's wealth in one stroke. In strictly financial terms, that's exactly what abolition represented, and the men who held that wealth had no intention of surrendering it peacefully. This is where the story shifts in a direction most popular accounts either skip over entirely or compress into a single throwaway line. The pre-war battle over slavery wasn't mainly about abolishing it where it already existed. It centered instead on who would control its expansion into the Western territories. Which leads to the second major point most retellings flatten out. Whatever their contradictions and compromises, the founders had engineered a genuinely delicate balancing act. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 established a boundary running along the 36th parallel, 30 minutes north. Below that line, slavery would remain legal within the Louisiana Territory. Above it, the practice was banned, with Missouri itself admitted as a slave state to balance Maine's simultaneous entry as a free one. It was a flawed, morally compromised arrangement, but it endured for more than 30 years because it maintained an exact balance of power in the Senate, with every slave state matched by a free one. That balance was everything. It served as the load-bearing wall of the entire antebellum political order, because so long as slave and free states remained equal in number, the South retained the power to block any legislation it saw as a threat. It could keep tariffs from rising too far, it could keep federal dollars from pouring exclusively into northern infrastructure projects, and most importantly, it could stop Congress from ever passing legislation that touched slavery itself. But the steady push westward kept eroding that equilibrium. Each new territory, every fresh application for statehood, reignited the identical crisis. Free or slave? That single question decided far more than the territory's own fate. It determined the balance of power in Washington itself, deciding who held the Senate, and by extension, who controlled the federal government. The Compromise of 1850 came next, another attempt to relieve the mounting pressure. California entered the Union as a free state, while New Mexico and Utah were organized under the principle of popular sovereignty, leaving the question of slavery to be settled by the settlers themselves. Bundled into that same compromise was a far harsher Fugitive Slave Act, which compelled northern states to return escaped enslaved people to their owners and impose severe penalties on anyone caught assisting them. It was intended to reassure the South that its human property would be honored everywhere in the country. Instead, it backfired badly, inflaming public opinion across the North, turning ordinary citizens into reluctant enforcers of slavery, and driving people who had once been indifferent toward the abolitionist cause. Then, in 1854, came the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and this marks the point where the entire framework began unraveling. Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, determined to secure a transcontinental railroad route running through Chicago, needed Southern votes to get the Nebraska Territory formally organized so that railroad could proceed. To win that support, he offered something extraordinary. Douglas proposed doing away with the Missouri Compromise entirely and applying popular sovereignty to both the Kansas and Nebraska territories, even though both sat north of the 3630 line and were supposed to remain permanently closed to slavery. Repealing the Missouri Compromise hit Washington like a political earthquake. It shattered a peace that had held for 34 years. Anti-slavery Northerners reacted with fury. The Whig Party, until then one of the nation's two dominant political organizations, essentially collapsed. Out of its wreckage emerged the Republican Party, built around a single unifying idea: preventing slavery from spreading any further. Not eliminating slavery outright, simply containing it. The party's earliest members weren't campaigning to free anyone who was already enslaved. They were campaigning to keep it out of the territories, nothing more. That distinction matters a great deal, and it's the third major point popular history consistently gets wrong. When Abraham Lincoln ran for the presidency in 1860, the man history would later celebrate as the great emancipator was not promising to abolish slavery. He ran on a promise to halt its spread. During his famous 1858 debates against Stephen Douglas, Lincoln laid out his actual position with real precision. He believed slavery was morally wrong. He opposed its extension into the territories, yet he also said, plainly and repeatedly, that he had neither the desire nor the constitutional authority to interfere with slavery where it already existed. That was hardly a radical abolitionist position. Judged against the standards of his own time, this counted as a genuinely moderate position. Yet to the Southern slaveholding class, containment alone still felt like an existential threat. And for one specific reason, cotton cultivation was, by its very nature, a business that had to keep moving. Heavy planting exhausted the soil in short order. Within just a handful of years, a given plantation's output would begin to drop, pushing planters to search for new land elsewhere. This is exactly why the institution had crept steadily westward across the first half of the century, moving from its roots in the tobacco fields of Virginia and the Carolinas into the rich lowlands of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, and finally into Texas. Cut off its path westward, and slavery would eventually find itself hemmed in on every side by free states, gradually strangled economically. Underneath all of this sat a simple political calculation as well. Should the territories join the Union as free states, the South stood to lose its balance in the Senate permanently. The region would be reduced to a permanent political minority. A Congress controlled by the North could then push tariffs as high as it liked, steer federal spending toward Northern projects, and sooner or later, perhaps inevitably, turn its attention to slavery directly. To the Southern elite, containment was never going to mean peaceful coexistence. It meant a slow, drawn-out death sentence, and the slaveholding class had no plans to accept that fate without resistance. Violence, in fact, arrived well before 1861. It erupted in Kansas almost as soon as the Kansas-Nebraska Act became law. Pro-slavery settlers streaming in from Missouri, mockingly nicknamed border ruffians, flooded into Kansas to rig elections and intimidate free state settlers. Anti-slavery migrants from New England, backed by organizations such as the New England Immigrant Aid Company, arrived in equal force to oppose them. Between 1855 and 1859, the territory descended into full-blown guerrilla warfare. The town of Lawrence was ransacked by pro-slavery raiders. In retaliation, the abolitionist John Brown led a party that killed 5 pro-slavery settlers with broadswords, an episode remembered as the Potawatomi Massacre. Rival territorial legislatures formed in parallel. Armed bands moved freely across the countryside. This period is remembered today as Bleeding Kansas, and in almost every meaningful way, it served as the true opening act of the Civil War. Kansas functioned as a proxy war, a live preview of the far larger conflict still on the horizon. What it proved was that legislation and negotiation alone could never settle the question of slavery's expansion. Force had become the only option left on the table, and on both sides of the divide, that reality was beginning to take hold. At the same time, the Supreme Court added fuel directly to the fire. In 1857, Chief Justice Roger Taney issued the Dred Scott decision, still regarded as one of the most infamous rulings in the court's history. At the heart of the case was Dred Scott, an enslaved man whose owner had taken him into free territory. Scott sued for his freedom, contending that his residence there had made him legally free. Taney's ruling reached well beyond the specific facts of the case. He held that Black Americans, enslaved or free, could not be citizens of the United States and therefore had no standing to sue in federal court at all. He went on to rule that Congress possessed no constitutional power to prohibit slavery in the territories whatsoever, a finding that effectively voided the Missouri Compromise and any measure like it. He further declared that enslaved people qualified as property under the protections of the Fifth Amendment, meaning owners could transport them anywhere in the country without their status as property ever changing. The Dred Scott decision did far more than settle one man's future. It knocked out the legal foundation the whole containment strategy had been built on. If Congress genuinely lacked the power to bar slavery from the territories, then the Republican Party's entire platform was, by this same logic, unconstitutional. The decision was a tremendous win for the South, but it simultaneously pushed the North toward a far harder position. If the courts refused to stop slavery's spread, perhaps political power was the only tool left. And if political power failed as well, perhaps violence was truly all that remained. By 1859, the country sat on the edge of eruption. John Brown, the very man responsible for the Potawatomi killings, led a raid on the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, aiming to arm enslaved people and touch off a wide-scale rebellion across the South. The raid failed. Brown was captured, tried, and executed by hanging. Yet the episode shook the South far more deeply than its outcome alone would seem to justify. Here was a white man, financed by Northern abolitionists, who had tried to ignite a violent uprising among the enslaved. To Southern observers, that was all the proof needed that the North had abandoned mere containment and now sought outright destruction of their way of life. In the North, Brown's hanging transformed him into a martyr almost instantly. Church bells tolled in tribute. Poets wrote elegies in his memory. Ralph Waldo Emerson went so far as to suggest that Brown would make the gallows as sacred as the cross itself. To Southerners, the North's reaction to the raid was even more alarming than the raid itself had been, evidence that a genuine portion of Northern society approved of armed action taken against slavery. Whatever fragile trust had still existed between North and South evaporated completely, which brings the story to 1860 and to Lincoln's election. He captured the presidency with just under 40% of the popular vote, and in 10 southern states, his name didn't even appear on the ballot. His win was a purely northern achievement, demonstrating for the first time that a candidate could reach the presidency without winning a single southern vote. The implications of that fact were chilling. If the North alone could decide who occupied the White House, then the South had, in effect, already lost the larger political struggle. Containment was no longer some hypothetical future danger. It was already underway. South Carolina seceded on December 20th, 1860, a mere 6 weeks after the election and a full 3 months before Lincoln was even inaugurated. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed in rapid succession, and by February of 1861, they had formally organized themselves into the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis at its head. Read the actual declarations of secession, and I'd sincerely encourage anyone listening to do exactly that, and they dismantled the notion that the war was chiefly about some abstract principle of states' rights. These are explicit documents. They name slavery outright, again and again. Mississippi's declaration states plainly that its position is tied completely to the institution of slavery, describing it as the greatest material interest in the world. Georgia's document lays out a long list of grievances, every one of them connected directly to slavery's status in the territories. South Carolina's focuses squarely on the North's refusal to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act and on the election of a president openly opposed to slavery. For its part, Texas points to Washington's failure to protect enslaved property along its own frontier. None of these read like vague documents. None of them amount to abstract essays on constitutional theory. They are declarations of economic and political war, plain and simple, and slavery is invoked over and over throughout their pages. The notion that this conflict was truly about states' rights rather than slavery is a post-war invention, one that emerged from the lost cause mythology that took root in the decades after the Confederacy's defeat. The men who actually ran the Confederacy had no difficulty whatsoever naming exactly what they were fighting to defend. Alexander Stephens, the Confederacy's vice president, stated it in terms that remain almost shocking in their bluntness in what became known as his cornerstone speech, delivered in March of 1861, declaring that the Confederacy's very foundation rested on the premise that black people were not the equals of white people, and that slavery, subjugation to what he termed a superior race, represented their natural condition. And here lies the paradox sitting at the heart of this entire story, one that historians frequently fail to explain with sufficient clarity. The conflict was, in full, about slavery, and at the very same time, it was about a great deal more than slavery alone. Those two statements aren't contradictory. They actually reinforce one another. Slavery occupied the center of the conflict precisely because it was interwoven with everything around it: trade policy, banking, westward expansion, constitutional law, foreign relations, and the entire structure of American capitalism itself. There's no way to separate slavery from the tariff disputes. It can't be pulled apart from the railroad question either, or from Wall Street, or from London, or from the cotton mills of Lancashire. Slavery was never simply one issue among many, competing for attention. It was the lens through which every other issue was refracted. Which brings the story to something most accounts barely touch on: the international dimension. The Civil War was never simply a domestic affair. It was, in truth, a global event, since the American cotton trade functioned as the literal engine driving the world's industrial economy. By the late 1850s, roughly 78% of Britain's cotton supply came directly from the American South. That single crop powered the British textile industry, which in turn drove the largest economy anywhere on Earth. The mill towns of Lancashire, Manchester, and Liverpool, chief among them, depended completely on an uninterrupted flow of southern cotton. Hundreds of thousands of British livelihoods hinged on the continued operation of the American plantation system, and the financial connections went even deeper than that. British merchant banks supplied much of the credit behind cotton's westward expansion, extending funds to Southern commission agents, who then lent that money to planters seeking land and enslaved labor. Of every strand woven through the transatlantic financial web, cotton was easily the most important. Jefferson Davis and the rest of the Confederate leadership grasped this dependence clearly and set out to convert it into leverage. Their approach, known as King Cotton diplomacy, rested on a fairly simple idea: cut off the supply of cotton, and Britain's textile industry would grind to a standstill, throwing enormous numbers of workers out of jobs and generating enough political pressure to force London into formally recognizing the Confederacy, breaking the Union's naval blockade, and quite possibly intervening on the Confederacy's behalf. For a stretch of time, this bold gamble genuinely appeared to be working. A real cotton famine hit Lancashire in 1862. Mills closed their doors, workers went without food, and delegations made up of merchants and manufacturers traveled to both London and Paris, pleading for recognition of the Confederacy and an end to the Union blockade. In France, Emperor Napoleon III made no secret of his sympathy for the Confederacy and his eagerness to see the cotton trade resume. A number of British leaders with financial interests tied to the South felt that same temptation. Yet the entire gambit ultimately fell apart for a handful of decisive reasons. First, unusually large southern cotton harvests in the 2 years leading up to the war had allowed both Britain and France to build up reserves substantial enough to cushion the initial shock. Second, British manufacturers moved quickly to diversify their sources, turning instead to cotton grown in Egypt, India, and Brazil. Third, and likely the most decisive factor of all, British public sentiment was firmly opposed to slavery, and the British working class, even while enduring genuine hardship during the famine, largely remained sympathetic to the Union's cause. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, issued in January of 1863, proved to be a genuine diplomatic masterstroke, since it reframed the entire conflict in unmistakably moral terms. With the war now officially framed around ending slavery, any European government offering open support to the Confederacy risked looking like an endorser of human bondage itself. Britain, which had already abolished slavery throughout its own empire back in 1833, could not risk being seen siding with slaveholders, regardless of how desperately its textile industry needed the cotton. There's another angle to this worth mentioning as well. Britain's strategic worries extended well beyond the cotton question. Going to war against the Union would have risked an invasion of Canada, potential losses to Britain's own merchant fleet, and disruption to food imports arriving from the American North, imports that had grown increasingly essential to British consumers. This wasn't merely a decision weighing cotton against morality. It amounted to a complete accounting of British strategic interests, examined from every angle. And once every one of those factors had been weighed, backing the Confederacy was judged simply too risky. France, under Napoleon III, stayed more sympathetic to the Confederate cause but refused to act without British support. And France, in any case, had pressing concerns closer to home, chief among them a rising threat from Prussia. Without Britain's participation, any French intervention was essentially doomed before it began. What all of this diplomatic maneuvering ultimately reveals is that the Civil War was, at its core, a crisis unfolding within the global capitalist system itself. The cotton trade tied the American South to European factories, to London's banking houses, and to New York's merchant firms, all bound together in a single web of mutual dependence. When secession and war ripped that web apart, the resulting shockwaves traveled straight across the Atlantic Ocean. This was never only an American story. It was a global reckoning with the contradictions built directly into an economy founded on enslaved human labor. Now, consider something else that the standard version of this story tends to lose entirely: the border states. Most people picture the Civil War as a tidy geographic split, North squared off against South. The reality was considerably messier than that. 4 slave states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, remained inside the Union the entire time, even though slavery was still legal within their borders. Lincoln recognized right away that losing any of these states would be catastrophic. Kentucky commanded the Ohio River, a vital transportation artery. Maryland wrapped around Washington, D.C. on 3 sides, meaning that if it seceded, the nation's capital would instantly become an island marooned inside Confederate territory. How Lincoln managed the border states reveals a great deal about what this conflict actually was. He couldn't openly present the war as a crusade against slavery, since doing so risked pushing the border states directly into Confederate hands. For the first year and a half of the fighting, Lincoln's official position held that the war's purpose was preserving the Union, not freeing anyone. General John Fremont issued an emancipation order in Missouri in 1861. Lincoln moved quickly to reverse it. When General David Hunter later freed enslaved people across South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, Lincoln reversed him as well. The president was navigating an extraordinarily narrow path, waging a war that slavery had caused, while publicly maintaining that the war had nothing to do with slavery, because admitting the truth risked losing the border states, and quite possibly the war itself. It's a genuine irony, and it's yet another detail the simplified version tends to omit. The war was, without question, about slavery, a fact the Confederacy itself openly admitted. But in its early stages, the Union genuinely couldn't say as much out loud because its own coalition still counted slaveholding states among its members. When the Emancipation Proclamation finally came, in January of 1863, it was a carefully engineered piece of policy. It freed enslaved people solely in territory still under Confederate control, land where Lincoln had no real power to enforce anything at all. It deliberately left out the border states, along with any southern territory already back under Union control. It served as much as a wartime measure, designed to cripple the Confederate economy and open the door to black enlistment in the Union military, as it did a statement of moral principle. None of that diminishes its significance in the slightest. It fundamentally changed what the war was actually about. It made the end of slavery an official objective of the Union war effort. It cleared the path toward the eventual 13th Amendment. And it made unmistakably clear that any negotiated peace-preserving slavery was now permanently off the table. But grasping the political tightrope Lincoln was walking when he issued it helped show just how genuinely complicated this conflict was. The Civil War was never a straightforward morality play. It was a political, economic, and military crisis of enormous complexity, one in which moral conviction was perpetually tangled up with cold, hard, strategic calculation. Now, step back for a moment and look at the deeper structural forces that made this war nearly impossible to avoid. Because the single biggest thing historians get wrong, in my view, isn't any particular fact. It's the framing of the whole story. The war is frequently presented as an outcome that could have been avoided, as though a wiser compromise or more capable leadership somewhere along the way might have spared 620,000 lives. But examine the underlying structural forces closely, and the war starts to look less like a diplomatic breakdown and more like the almost inevitable result of an economic contradiction that simply had no peaceful resolution. For the first half of the 19th century, the United States functioned, in practice, as two entirely separate countries flying a single flag. The North was industrializing at a breathtaking pace, erecting factories, railroads, and canals, and drawing in successive waves of European immigrant labor to staff its growing manufacturing base. Its economy was diversifying and urbanizing right before everyone's eyes. The South, by contrast, stayed locked into a single-crop agricultural system powered by enslaved labor, exporting raw materials while producing almost no manufactured goods of its own. It had fewer railroads, fewer factories, fewer schools, fewer cities. What wealth it had was concentrated among a small planter aristocracy whose entire standing depended on slavery's continued existence. Each of these two economic systems needed something fundamentally different from Washington. The North wanted high tariffs to protect its young industries. The South wanted low tariffs to keep the price of imported goods down. Heavy federal investment in the roads, canals, and railroads binding its industrial network together was exactly what the North wanted. The South was wary of any federal spending that didn't directly benefit its agricultural economy. The North wanted a national banking system able to supply reliable credit for industrial expansion. The South preferred a looser, more decentralized financial setup, one that kept power concentrated in state-level banks. And beneath every single one of these policy disputes sat the very same fundamental question: whether slavery would expand. Northerners understood that if slavery took hold in the Western territories, those territories would develop along Southern lines, becoming raw material economies built on enslaved labor, and would end up as the South's allies in Congress, tilting the balance of power permanently. Southerners understood the exact reverse. Territories closed off to slavery would grow into free labor, manufacturing-driven economies, becoming allies of the North and leaving the South politically isolated. This was never merely political rivalry. It was an existential clash between two economic and social orders that were fundamentally incompatible. And the real tragedy of the antebellum decades is that each successive compromise only delayed the reckoning without ever resolving the underlying contradiction itself. The Missouri Compromise purchased roughly 34 years of peace. The Compromise of 1850 managed barely a decade, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act didn't even hold for a single year before violence broke out. Every successive compromise proved weaker than the last because the underlying problem was never a policy disagreement that could be negotiated away. It was a structural incompatibility, one that could only be resolved by one system defeating the other completely. The Southern elite grasped this dynamic, arguably better than any other group involved, which explains the ferocity with which they fought to protect slavery's right to expand. They understood that containment amounted to slow extinction. They knew that a permanent free state majority in Congress would sooner or later come after their property, their political influence, and their entire way of life. And they stood ready to destroy the Union itself, rather than accept such a future. What's genuinely unsettling about this story is the sheer depth of the financial system's involvement at every single stage. Labor was never the only role enslaved people were forced into. They functioned as financial assets too, put up as collateral against loans, folded into mortgage instruments, and bought and sold on domestic markets that operated with all the cold efficiency of a modern commodity exchange. Long before Wall Street would invent the mortgage-backed securities that later triggered a financial collapse of its own, Southern banks had already pioneered a version of that same idea, constructing financial products in which the underlying collateral was a human being. The parallel isn't perfect, but the underlying logic is uncomfortably familiar. A financial system built around treating a morally indefensible asset as a pillar of economic stability, right up until the contradiction became impossible to sustain. Northern banks bore their share of complicity too, Trade in slave-grown crops ran on financing they supplied. Cotton shipments moving from southern ports to European mills were underwritten by these same firms. Southern trading agents and commission merchants serving the plantation economy relied directly on credit these banks extended. Northern insurance firms went so far as writing policies on enslaved people, insuring them against loss, exactly as they would insure any other piece of property. By one route or another, the labor and the bodies of enslaved African Americans formed the foundation the entire American financial system was built on. Once war actually arrived, economic realities did nearly as much to shape its outcome as anything that happened on a battlefield. Roughly 23 million people lived in the North. The South had roughly 9 million, nearly 4 million of them enslaved and legally barred from serving as soldiers, at least until the war's final, desperate months. The North controlled the majority of the country's railroad mileage, the majority of its manufacturing output, and the majority of its financial infrastructure. The South had cotton, conviction, and courage in ample supply. Had the war been brief, the Confederacy's advantages in military leadership and defensive terrain might well have carried it to victory. But it wasn't brief, and over a long conflict, the North's advantages in industry and population proved simply overwhelming. By 1865, the Confederacy was exhausted, its economy in ruins, its infrastructure wrecked, its labor system collapsing completely. The 13th Amendment, ratified that December, formally abolished slavery throughout the United States, erasing in a single stroke what had once been the nation's single largest financial asset. Few acts of expropriation anywhere in American history compare to it in scale, and arguably the same holds true across modern world history generally. Something like $3.5 billion in wealth simply vanished, with no compensation offered whatsoever. Nowhere else in the Western Hemisphere did the end of slavery come at anything close to this cost. When Britain abolished slavery in 1833, it compensated the slaveholders. France followed the same approach. In the United States, the only compensation slaveholders ever received came in the form of military defeat. And here's the last piece of this that I think historians consistently underweight. Ending slavery was not the war's only achievement. It rebuilt the entire structure of the American state from the ground up. Before the war, people often described the United States as a loose confederation, a union of sovereign states held together by a comparatively weak central government. After the war, something categorically different emerged. A centralized national government with the power to levy income taxes, draft soldiers, issue a single national currency, and enforce its laws with overwhelming military force. Settling the slavery question was not the whole of what this war accomplished. A far bigger question got resolved alongside it. What kind of country America actually was? Going forward, the United States would operate as a single nation, rather than a loose collection of states, federal authority now sitting supreme with the principle firmly established in blood that no minority could simply veto the will of the majority through secession. Economically, the aftershocks proved every bit as transformative. Once the planter class was defeated and the slave economy dismantled, nothing stood in the way of rapid American industrialization. Free labor settlers gained access to Western land through the Homestead Act. The Pacific Railroad Acts authorized construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. Land-grant universities across the country traced their existence back to the Morrill Act. The National Banking Acts created a single, unified national currency and banking system. Southern opposition in Congress had blocked every single one of these measures for years. With Southern representatives no longer present, they sailed through almost immediately. The Civil War accomplished more than the liberation of 4 million people. It unleashed the forces that pushed the United States from an agricultural republic into an industrial power. Even so, the human toll was staggering. 620,000 lives lost, with millions more left wounded, uprooted, or permanently scarred. Whole cities lay in ashes, and the agricultural economy had been gutted. For the 4 million people newly freed from bondage, emancipation marked only the beginning of a far longer struggle for genuine equality, a struggle that continues to this day. What Reconstruction promised was dismantled, piece by piece, through deliberate policy rather than neglect. The wealth taken from generations of enslaved laborers was never restored, and the racial caste system slavery had erected was rebuilt in new guises, through black codes, convict leasing, sharecropping, segregation, and roughly a century of state-sanctioned violence and discrimination. So if you're asking what historians actually get wrong about the Civil War, here's how I'd put it. The facts aren't usually where they stumble, the story itself is. They frame it as a war about a single thing, slavery, or else about some other single thing, states' rights, when in reality it was about the entire structure of American life. Who would hold the economy? Who would hold the reins of government? Who would decide the fate of the territories? Who would even get to decide what freedom actually meant inside the most powerful nation in the Western Hemisphere? Slavery functioned as the fulcrum beneath every one of those questions, yet what truly drove events was an entangled mix of economic, political, diplomatic, constitutional, and ideological forces, all moving at once toward a collision no compromise could have permanently headed off. This war was neither an accident nor a failure of leadership. It was the nearly inevitable outcome of building a nation on a foundation that was, at once, morally indefensible and economically unsustainable. The real tragedy is that, resolving a contradiction the founders had already written directly into the Constitution back in 1787, required 620,000 deaths, a contradiction born the moment they agreed to count each enslaved person as 3/5 of a human being for purposes of representation, and then simply moved forward. That original decision still echoes now. None of the wealth extracted from 2.5 centuries of enslaved labor was ever restored. The racial hierarchies slavery constructed were never fully dismantled, and the economic disparities the plantation system produced continue to shape American life today in ways the country is only beginning to reckon with fully. If this whole story teaches anything, it's that major conflicts never trace back to simple origins. They run layered and structural, buried deep inside whatever economic foundation a given society happens to be built on. Slavery alone never fully explains the American Civil War. At stake was the kind of capitalism America would practice, the kind of democracy it would build, and the kind of nation it would eventually grow into. And in that sense, it remains a story that hasn't fully finished being written, even now. If you found this deep dive worthwhile, a like and a subscribe would genuinely mean a lot. It doesn't cost you anything, it helps far more than you'd expect. And it's what makes documentaries like this one possible to keep making. I'll catch you in the next one.